everyone, Susan Storm here, and today I want to talk about some of the most vilified types in the Myers-Briggs system. And when I say vilified, I'm going to particularly focus on the world of the type community. So there's how people are treated in day-to-day life with everyday people who know nothing about type. And then there's the people who are vilified in personality forums, Facebook groups, any kind of community where type is the dominating subject. So we're going to start with some of the types that I see very frequently vilified, talked bad about, dismissed, belittled in the type community. As an MBTI practitioner, I feel like I have a good grasp on this because I've been a part of the type community for over 10 years and I interact with lots of people. I get lots of comments and lots of emails where people will unfortunately vilify other types, or they will have this very stereotypical one-sided view of a type and think that is all that there is to the type. Maybe they've had a bad experience with someone with that type, or perhaps they're even mistyping someone as having a certain type that they don't have. Whatever the case, this is just my perspective. Obviously, you might have a different perspective, so leave a comment. If you do, let's get started. The number one most vilified type that I've experienced and seen in the type community is ENTJ. A lot of ENTJ type descriptions focus very much on their logic, their practicality, their go-getter nature, their ambition, and they infer that because they're that way, they have no heart, no feelings, no emotions, don't care about anyone else. All they care about is climbing the ladder to success. They don't care who they step on the way to get there. So what we have here is a problem where a lot of descriptions are describing an unhealthy version of the type. And that's only fair if you're doing that across the board. If you are going to describe an ENTJ with an unhealthy version of their type, then you need to do the same thing for INFJ, for INFP, for ISFJ. But in many situations, these type descriptions very much focus on only one side of the ENTJ and they imbue a personal story with it that's negative, and they leave out a lot of the other really amazing things that come into play, especially with a healthy ENTJ. And you see this a lot in character descriptions. If you're a fan of personality database or if you love to find characters that have these types, one thing that I found early on is when I looked up ENTJ characters, I was finding people like Voldemort, I was finding people like Cruella de Vil, Ryomen Sukuna, all villains for the most part. Patrick Bateman, like literal sociopaths or psychopaths, anyone who was power hungry, devoid of any kind of moral compass, they were an ENTJ in these character descriptions. And it really bothered me because ENTJs are no more likely to be villains than any other type. In fact, I saw many feeling types being mistyped as thinking villains. I really could go on a big ramble right now about what makes someone a villain, but generally speaking, the hunger for power can be a hunger for any personality type. A personality who's really good at manipulating emotions, playing a part, orchestrating social dynamics is much more likely to be an extroverted feeling villain rather than an ENTJ villain. And then if we're talking about sociopaths and psychopaths, we really don't want to type them too much because there's so much other stuff at play. And in a movie or TV show, you're really only seeing a small portion of who someone is. And a lot of what you're seeing, is in the case of Patrick Bateman, for example, is just their personality disorder. And so we really don't want to focus too much on typing characters like that. And then there are the comments and the emails, and most people that I see commenting about ENTJs are like, oh, well, they're soulless. They have no moral compass. They do not care about anyone else. It's all about ends justifies the means. And perhaps they had a bad experience with an ENTJ. And so then they think all ENTJs are like this. This is what a healthy ENTJ will look like. Healthy ENTJ combines that very pragmatic, goal-oriented focus with balance from their introverted feeling side, which is all about their values, what they personally feel is right or wrong. If a type is healthy, if a person is healthy, they are going to have a strong connection to that inferior function. Another word for the inferior function, which I sometimes like to use instead, is the aspiring function. We often aspire to use our inferior function well, but it often feels like it's murky and foggy and confusing. So for an ENTJ with aspiring introverted feeling, they do want to find what is personally significant to them. They do want to in accordance with their values, but sometimes it's confusing to them to know exactly what those values are or to prioritize them. In fact, many ENTJs give and give to their goals, their long-term goals, and they do not do things that will make them personally happy. And that's part of the problem with inferior or aspiring introverted feeling is that it can feel really out of reach. Some ENTJs may struggle to know what really ultimately matters to them. But this doesn't mean that they do not have personal values or morals. In fact, most of the ENTJs I've known have a very strong set of values and morals. And often those values and morals guide those big decisions that they make, those big goals that they have. For example, my dad is an ENTJ. He puts a lot of his work and monetary resource into supporting orphanages in third world countries and helping children with food in third world countries. That's a huge focus for him. Meet him, he may not seem like the warmest, friendliest person you've ever come across, but it doesn't mean he lacks values or morals. I know another ENTJ who is very involved in creating clean water in communities that do not have access to it, communities where their water sources have been polluted. And that's her entire job. That's her entire focus is really making clean water accessible for people around the world. ENTJs are very much guided by their sense of right and wrong, but where inferior or aspiring introverted feeling can trip them up is they may not always know what they want. They may struggle to prioritize their own personal needs, instead focusing on the most logical way to achieve a specific goal or vision. They can get very caught up in the metrics, the return on investment, the numbers, and they can lose sight of their personal feelings or even the personal feelings of the people around them. So, yes, they can come off as very brusque. They can come off as very direct and blunt, but this does not mean that they are super villains and that they're out there to get everyone and that they have no morals or no values. Number two, this shouldn't be a big surprise, ESTJ. If you type into Google, what I found is why are ESTJs so mean, so controlling, so arrogant, so manipulative? And in my interactions with people, I've often found many people burned by ESTJs or who they thought were ESTJs. ESTJs, like ENTJs, often are vilified as being very cruel. They're seen as being all about themselves and about power, dictatorial, and forcing everyone to do things the way that they've always done it, micromanaging people. And yes, unhealthy ESTJs can be that way. I'm not saying that any of these types are not these ways when they're unhealthy. What I am saying is that in the type community, we tend to focus on certain types as unhealthy versions of the type and constantly describe them as that way. And then other types, we only describe them as healthy versions of the type. And that's not really a fair way to compare the two types. If you're always saying that INFJs are super healthy and amazing and wonderful and mystical and insightful and selfless, and you're always saying that ESTJs are selfish, cruel, dictatorial, and micromanaging, it's like saying grapes are bad because you're comparing a rotten grape to a kiwi that's fresh and delicious and plump. You can't do that because you have to compare them at the same level of health. So an ESTJ that is healthy will have a connection to their aspiring introverted feeling in the same way that an ENTJ would. So you have to compare a healthy ENTJ to a healthy INFJ, and a healthy ENTJ is very proactive. They love to help out in their communities. They want to make a difference in their communities. They're very good at creating traditions for the people they care about that create a sense of continuity, stability, and meaning in life. They're the people who are going to have that harvest party every fall, or they're going to have certain rituals and routines that are really special and bring people together. Healthy ESTJs back up that very decisive, directive, goal-oriented side with a strong sense of right and wrong. Just because, again, just because introverted feeling is in the fourth slot for ESTJs, this does not mean they have no morals or no emotions or anything like that. What it boils down to is that they have a harder time knowing what their personal emotions are. They may not spend a lot of time introspecting about their feelings. They may have a hard time prioritizing the things that make them happy or give them a sense of satisfaction or inspiration. And instead, what they may do is focus so much on tasks, to-do lists, goals, projects, metrics, and return on investment. Introverted feeling is very much about what do I personally think is right? What do I need for me? What are my emotions telling me? How do I feel? What's going to make me feel meaningful in this moment. And ESTJs may struggle with that, but it doesn't mean they don't value it. It is the aspiring function. It is the function that they constantly throughout their life wish was in their grasp. So sometimes ESTJs, you may not see it on the outside, but have a strong desire to have clarity here. That's often why so many times I see ESTJs in relationships with INFPs. I know so many ESTJ INFP couples that I've worked with in my time as a practitioner, that I've communicated with in the type community. It's just extremely prevalent, and that's because ESTJs do value introverted feeling. So they often end up with introverted feeling types. All right, so let's move on to the number three, the most vilified type, in my opinion. And that's going to be the INFP. Some people are surprised by this, but I do see them vilified as being selfish, vilified as being overly emotional and overly sensitive or crybabies. So people stereotype them as being very emo. And it's very frustrating because INFPs, this is like the last thing they would want to be seen as. When you type why are INFPs in Google, it tends to autofill with things like weird, hated, sensitive, cute, not so bad, but overall, a lot of times the descriptions of INFPs are patronizing and condescending. And the truth is, I think a lot of types are getting mistyped as INFP and kind of muddying the waters of what an INFP actually is. INFPs are actually pretty contained about their emotions. Yes, they may cry about things, but INFPs tend to hold their feelings really close. In fact, Isabel Briggs Myers wrote it in her book, Gifts Differing, that the warmth of the INFP is like a fur-lined coat. It's all on the inside. They tend to not show it as much on the outside. INFPs can seem very stoic. Carl Jung expressed this in his book, Psychological Types. He said introverted feeling types often appear stoic and inaccessible. INFPs do not tend to be these wild crybabies who take everything personally and can't stop freaking out about life. Instead, INFPs are very filled with a sense of conviction and purpose. They want to live a life that lies in accordance with their values, and they're willing to do almost anything to defend those values. One part of introverted feeling is just knowing what is ultimately meaningful to you, what really matters to you, what you would fight and even die for. So many times throughout history, you'll see INFPs doing things that are very daring to defend a value that's important to them. People like Joan of Arc or Nellie Bly or Harriet Tubman. Now, of course, I can't go back in history and interview those people. There's a chance that the mainstream typings on them are incorrect. They do demonstrate a very obvious truth about INFPs, which is that if they believe something is right, they will do anything to defend it. And they will dedicate their lives to defending that value. Introverted feeling is their hero function. Introverted feeling is about what is important to me, what is meaningful and significant to me, what matters to me. A subjective sense of morality that is less about what mainstream society says or how everyone's going to feel about it. It's less harmony seeking and more a strong sense of conviction and purpose to do what you believe is right, even if it goes against the grain. So there's actually something pretty badass about introverted feeling and about INFPs because not only are they willing to go against the grain to do what they believe is right, they are also willing to think outside the box and go against convention with extroverted intuition. This can make them very influential writers who change the course of history. The cute, crybaby, oversensitive descriptions really undermine a lot of what INFPs are and what they've been and how much they've really improved the world. My pick for number four, most vilified personality type, is INTP. When I typed in why are INTPs into Google, I got so weird, so mean, so lazy, and I also got so smart, which they might like that one. They do tend to be, from my experience, pretty smart people. But they also tend to, in real life and in the type community, be seen as kind of argumentative, lazy, pedantic, weird, non-conventional types. And the whole lazy thing is just a giant misinterpretation. Some INTPs are lazy. Some ESTJs are lazy. And some types are lazy about different things. What an ESFJ is lazy about, an ISTJ is not going to be lazy about, etc. INTP are ultimately truth seekers. They want to have mastery and knowledge and competence. They want to understand how the world works with a clarity that many other people do not have a passion for. Because of this, they do tend to get frustrated in life because so many people rely on mental shortcuts to make a point. It's just more energy efficient. It's just easier to make logical leaps sometime because your overall point makes sense than to have every single facet of every single thing perfectly logically coherent. And so INTPs often feel like they're living in a world where they're watching everyone do all this stupid crap all the time and they can't say anything because throughout their lives, when they've said things about it, they've gotten called insensitive, mean, argumentative, disrespectful, etc. They also get called pedantic all the time because people use logical fallacies and rely on them all the time in arguments. And they do feel a compulsion to point it out. And then when they do, they're called pedantic and nitpicky. And they constantly feel like they are being dismissed. And then there's the whole mean thing. INTPs are generally very gentle people in my experience. In fact, I once spoke with a whole giant group of INTPs, and then I spoke in forums and things like that, or asked questions in forums. And I found that most INTPs are actually fairly conflict avoidant. Of course, you have to make an exception. There are like Enneagram 8 INTPs who are not so conflict avoidant, but for the most part, my experience, INTPs are fairly conflict avoidant. In fact, they really want to have harmonious relationships with other people. Their inferior function, extroverted feeling, that's their aspiring function, gives them a desire to feel connected to people, to feel like they belong. However, because they are introverted thinking types and they all have that driving, heroic search for truth and accuracy, they're often seen as ruffling feathers or rocking the boat for the sake of truth. So there's part of them that really seeks out truth and really seeks out accuracy and can't help but say, hey, you're using a straw man here, or whatever it is. And that gets in the way of their simultaneous desire for connection, warmth, and friendship. Many INTPs struggle with shyness. They struggle with feeling like they don't quite belong. They struggle with small talk, which they often find maddening. But deep down, is that coming from a place of meanness? If someone wants to give you clarity of information and to correct misinformation, does that make them mean? No. In the INTP's case, it means that they actually really want to help people to have clarity, to have thorough understanding, because that's ultimately what they're seeking. ENFJs, who are so warm and empathetic and conscientious, they give people a sense of emotional connection. And we often see that as the one way to be nice. The extroverted feeling way is the best way to be a kind, considerate person. It's to be conscientious and empathetic and tactful. And that is an amazing thing. And I highly value that. However, for an INTP or an ISTP, their way of helping, of being considerate and caring, is to provide clarity of information, to help you troubleshoot, to help you understand the nuances of something, to help you clear up any loopholes and kinks in your understanding of a concept or an idea. That's their way of caring, and it's no less significant than the FJ way of caring, which is more accepted by modern society as being kind. So, one of the things that I keep coming back to when I write about type, when I talk about type, is that there are many different ways to be kind. There are many different ways to be helpful. There are many different ways to be lazy or weird, etc. For INTPs, their way of caring and being kind is often misunderstood and it's seen as being insensitive or arrogant when it's really coming from a place of genuine concern. Now, over time, many INTPs become jaded because of these repeated experiences. And so, over time, many INTPs do end up shutting out people, and they do sometimes become more insensitive because they just have to stop caring to protect their own emotional well being. Number 5 is ISTJ. ISTJs are often seen as being very emotionless, robotic, boring in the type community. In the type community, I've seen so many people complain about this type. I've seen so many people just drag all the beauty and nuance and the interesting features of this type. It's like they poked a bunch of holes in the ice and all the interesting stuff leak out, and then they're like, this is all this type is. They're just a cold, emotionless robot who follows orders and does things the way they've always been done and has no ability to laugh about anything. And it's just like awful, awful descriptions. They're just seen as emotionless traditionalists, very stubborn, very stuck in their ways. Again, you're looking at a one-dimensional, unhealthy version of the type, a caricature of the type, and not the reality of the type. I'm going to use some fictional ISTJs, just throw in here, and I want you to think about, do you see these people as boring, robotic traditionalists? Rick Grimes in The Walking Dead, ISTJ, okay? Did he seem like a boring, robotic, emotionless traditionalist? I don't think so. If you watch anime, you've seen Jujutsu Kaisen, you might have seen Kento Nanami, one of my favorite anime characters. And yes, he has to be home and done with work by a very certain time. He has a very regimented way of being, but would you say he's emotionless or unkind? I don't think so. Deep down, he's driven by a very strong sense of right and wrong. He's very responsible, he's very protective, and he's also very amusing. Sometimes, if you're not paying attention, you miss ISJ's humor because it can be very deadpan and it can be very dry. So there's just a couple fictional ISTJs, but there are so many more. ISTJs are introverted sensing dominant types. Introverted sensing is one of the most horribly described functions in the Myers-Briggs system. Intuitives tend to think of it as just being detail oriented. But that's not really the fullness of what it is. Introverted sensing, what it really means is subjective sense impressions. So introverted sensing types don't just see something for what it is, they see a subjective interpretation of that thing and they associate all these past memories and meanings with that thing. I like to use the example of an apple. If an extroverted sensing type, an SP, sees an apple, they're like, ooh, that's an apple. It's this type of apple. I think it would taste good. I want to bite into the apple. They're very oriented towards experience. ISTJs, they might see an apple and they might think, oh, that reminds me of the time my grandmother made apple pie with me when I was a kid, and I really miss my grandmother and the specific experience and this time I climbed an apple tree. And this apple signifies not just the taste of the apple, but memories associated with the apple. And so there's all these personal, subjective impressions related to the object. And so they see these impressions in everything. So they're constantly past referencing these memories associated with everything that they're experiencing right now. And it creates a lot of depth and meaning and personal resonance that other people may not be able to see from the outside. Here's one of the ways that Carl Jung described introverted sensing. He said, we could say that introverted sensation transmits an image which does not so much reproduce the object as spread over it the patina of age-old subjective experience and the shimmer of events still unborn. The bare sense impression develops in depth, reaching into the past and future, while extroverted sensation seizes on the momentary existence of things open to the light of day. So, does that sound like a boring function? Does it sound very concrete and emotionless and devoid of any meaning or significance? Absolutely not. There's a lot of magic to introverted sensation. It sees something and it brings in all this meaning and history from the past into that present moment. But Carl Jung also said that it can spread over it with it the shimmer of events still unborn. Introverted sensing types are not only stuck in the past. That's not just what they are. They can also think of how the past could infiltrate and influence the future. And this is why they tend to create these really special and routines because they have some beautiful past experience and they want to recreate it in the future. They could be experiencing a beautiful Thanksgiving dinner, for example, and then in that moment be thinking, I want to create this experience when I'm a grandparent. I want to create this experience for my children to pass on to their children. And they're aware of the timelessness of things and also the brevity of life and the importance of creating the sense of stability and creating these beautiful moments and bringing them from the past to the present and future. Every ISTJ that I have known is very nostalgic. They love to go to places they have special memories around. They love to revisit special traditions. They love to watch the movies they loved when they were kids. So there's a very beautiful, nostalgic, sentimental side of the ISTJ that many people don't realize. On top of that, behind their actions, behind that very responsible, regimented, hardworking side that we focus on, there's a great depth of feeling. ISTJs have tertiary introverted feeling. This is another word for the tertiary function is the eternal child function. This is the part of us that can feel very confident, like the king of the world one moment, and then feel very vulnerable and insecure the next. ISTJs tend to be very guarded about their emotions. They tend to be very careful and selective about who they show their emotions to. This does not mean they do not feel deeply. In fact, every ISTJ I know talks about having much deeper emotions than people realize. They just don't show it on their face. They don't feel like they need to talk about it too much. They can often feel vulnerable talking about their emotions because if there's any sort of criticism or judgment about their emotions, then Because this is the child function, it can feel very vulnerable and hurt very quickly. So ISTJs are much more sensitive than they let on, but they tend to show the world that very hardworking, regimented, pragmatic side. All right, next, number 6 is the ESFP. Not so much necessarily in real life, but in the type community, these types are very much described as very airheaded party animal types that don't really have a lot going on in their minds. I've had so many interactions with people who just talk about ESFPs in this super one-dimensional, shallow way. Sure, they're lots of fun to be around and they may be able to crack some jokes, but there's just not much going on between the ears. And this is just so frustrating to me because honestly, ESFPs are one of my favorite types. And I hear so much crap about them from everyone. And so I always feel like I got to stick up for these types because I just absolutely adore them in real life. When they are unhealthy, they can be shallow. They can be so focused on fun, entertainment, and pleasure that they lose sight of what's ultimately meaningful and they don't think things through, right? That's a great example of an unhealthy ESFP. However, just like I've talked about before, we can't describe ESFPs as only the unhealthy versions of their type. And we can't compare an unhealthy ESFP to, say, a healthy INTJ and say that one is better than the other because we're not doing it fair. ESFPs, ultimately, they're very realistic people. They have a heightened awareness of what's real, what's relevant, and what's needed in the moment. They can be just the people you need in a crisis because they know what needs to be done. I've been in crisis situations with an ESFP before, and while everyone else is panicking and freaking out and not really knowing what to do, they tend to be very pragmatic, very confident, and actually very smart in those situations. ESFPs are also driven by introverted feeling. This is their second function. So they have a strong sense of what's ultimately meaningful to them, what matters, what their heart is telling them. And they can be very fiery in pursuit of fairness, in pursuit of protecting the underdog. One of my good friends is an ESFP, and she will do anything to protect the people she cares about. Whether that means showing up when someone needs some help, whether that means going to a protest and speaking out for people that she feels are being persecuted. They feel very passionately about their causes. So they're not just these party animals who only care about having fun. ESFPs are very driven, passionate people, and they are often very proactive in their communities and in the world to make a difference for the people they care about. I know a lot of ESFPs who work overseas in difficult or dangerous situations to try to help people. I know an ESFP who works with Doctors Without Borders or an ESFP who works with the Red Cross. And they work in dangerous situations, but they feel very strongly that they need to help children in these situations to be able to be safe, to be able to get food, to be able to get medical attention. So there's a lot more to ESFPs than the stereotype. And so the very shallow party animal, annoying, vapid description of ESFP is really frustrating and very prevalent in the type community. All right, number 7, I'm going to say is the INTJ. INTJs tend to have, like many of the types, one-dimensional descriptions. Now, their descriptions can be a lot more flattering. In fact, it drives many people to want to be defined as INTJ. They're called masterminds, geniuses, strategists, and things like this, chess masters. Like they're seen as having this godlike knowledge of how everything is going to be able to play out. And some INTJs do genuinely believe that they have that. I've definitely encountered those who are like, I know everything before everyone else knows it. Maybe they do. However, again, like ENTJs, if you look INTJs up online, you're often going to find them described as villains. Villains in movies and TV shows are often typed as INTJs or ENTJs. And this tells you something. This tells you that people tend to think of these types as being very power hungry, ambitious, self centered, just uncaring about people and the human race. And I see this in comments about INTJs too. And I see this in comments from supposed INTJs who say they don't care, they don't have feelings, or they never think about their emotions or never process anything. And I don't always trust that people actually are correctly typed, but I'm not going to get into that. In general, INTJs are often stereotyped as being cold, power hungry, visionary, intelligent, but also not really caring about anyone else but themselves. And so let's talk about that. While INTJs may struggle with tact or small talk or giving off a really warm vibe, this does not mean that INTJs are devoid of feeling or that they don't care. INTJs are introverted intuitive types. They are driven to understand the big whys of the universe. Why are we here? What's the meaning of life? What's the dance of the universe? What are the things that everyone else is missing? Where is that last domino going to fall? What are the ripple effects of current situations? Introverted intuition also gives INTJs the ability to shift perspectives, to step outside of their own perspective and see things from many different perspectives. Because of that, INTJs often are more empathetic than they seem. They may just not show it really readily to everyone else. But often they can step outside of their perspective and see how someone in this perspective or that perspective or different perspectives might feel. They can, in a really meta way, understand that everyone has a billion experiences that led them to where they are, and they can step into that perspective and make sense of it. On top of that, INTJs are extroverted thinking types. Extroverted thinking is their helping function. So every type has what's called a mother-father function, and that's often the function that they use to help others. For INTJs, that function is extroverted thinking. So everyone cares. All 16 personality types care, but they show it in different ways. The INTJ shows they care through extroverted thinking. And to some people, this doesn't look like caring because they only want to see caring in this very empathic, warm, friendly, intimate way. They're not used to seeing caring as, let me help you fix that problem. Let me help you plan something. Let me help you troubleshoot something. That to them is just seen as this thing sideways of caring. It's a totally other category. But for INTJs, that is helping. That is their love language. INTJs are going to help you by trying to help you come up with a strategy, a plan. They're going to try to help you solve a problem. They're going to look for the underlying reasons why you keep having a problem. They're going to give you advice, or they're going to step in to try to help in a practical way. Unfortunately, this is often seen as not really being caring. Many people do not want advice. They do not want troubleshooting. They just want someone who's going to listen to their problems and provide a lot of empathy and support and comfort. They want to feel emotionally supported in a way that perhaps more of a feeling type would do it. But this does not mean that thinking types do not care. In fact, they can care just as deeply as feeling types do, but they're going to show it in a different way. So often when INTJs step in to try to help someone in a situation, when they try to provide practical support, logic, advice, troubleshooting, that's seen more as them being arrogant or critical or bossy. And so often their efforts to show they care are interpreted in completely the opposite way. So many INTJs are vilified for that, and many INTJs become jaded because of that, in the same way that many INTPs become jaded. And so many INTJs feel like the ways that they try to show they care are not appreciated by other people. They are misunderstood and they get frustrated with the whole process, and some just tune out. On top of that, INTJs also have introverted feeling in that eternal child position, just like I was talking about with ISTJs. INTJs have deeper, more sensitive feelings than they let on, but they are very selective about who they show those to. But this does not mean they don't have emotions, feelings, or a strong sense of right and wrong. INTJs do have this. This is a human thing, but their emotions are usually just not readily apparent on the surface. All right, so these are my picks for the 7 most vilified Myers-Briggs personality types. I could definitely point out ways that all of the other types are vilified, particularly in real life. So some of these types I've talked about right now may not have as much hardship in day-to-day life. For example, ESTJs in day-to-day life often don't have these negative stereotypes following them wherever they go. In the type community, however, there are a lot of negative stereotypes. This video today was specifically talking about the types that are vilified in the type community, and these are my 7 picks for the 7 most vilified types. But let me know what you think in the comments. I would love to hear your opinions, your stories. Keep in mind, I've spoken to people of every single type who have been unfairly vilified. There is a major problem in type communities, especially like forums and social media groups, where people will vilify types. They will stereotype everyone. They'll say, I experienced an ESFJ who was like this, so they're all like that. For a topic that's supposed to promote understanding and self-awareness, there are a lot of really mean, judgmental, unself-aware people in the type community. There's a lot of wonderful people too, but you're going to run into both if you are in the type community. So to anyone who has been unfairly vilified, demonized, belittled, I am so sorry you've experienced that. If you want to vent about it in the comments, though, that's a great place to do it. I would like to raise more awareness of this so that people can have a more fleshed out understanding of type and think twice before belittling a type, but also so that people who have had this experience understand that we do see this. A lot of us in the tech community see this and realize it's a problem. It is something that we want to change. If you'd like to watch more videos like this, as always, like and subscribe. If you would like to read articles I've written about the 16 personality types, definitely check out my website at psychologyjunkie.com. If you're not sure about your personality type and you would like to talk to me about getting clarity, I do offer type clarification sessions where we can talk, we can get to know you and what's really working for you and your personality and what your natural preferences are. So you can book a session with me. I'll leave a link in the description. And if you're thinking, well, why should I talk to you? What expertise do you have? Why am I even watching your video? That's a good question. I am a certified MBTI practitioner. I've been doing this for many years. I've been trained in interaction styles as well as Myers-Briggs, as well as Enneagram. And I've probably had over 1,000 sessions in my lifetime. So this is something I love to do. It's my favorite part of my job. I love being able to help people get more clarity on how their mind works. And I would love to help you if you're interested. And if you have a question, feel free to leave a comment, and I will see you next time for my next video. Bye, everyone.